good challenge, big challenge, but for you or student or faculty members, I think it's a good topics for discussion. So enjoy your discussion. And once again, thank you for both speaker. And thanks also for IMF who facilitate this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for that wonderful remarks. So now please allow me to introduce you to our moderator for today's seminar. Just let me touch the tip of an iceberg from Mr. Gunadi's vast background. He is an economist with more than 20 years of professional experience, both in national and international organizations areas, in areas of public policy engagement, dialogue, research, assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. He is also an active lecturer in Faculty of Economic and Business, and he gained his PhD degree from the University of Groningen on 2008. Please, Mr. Hari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. This is not a musical concert. They are all my students, and usually they always have good comments and good applause whenever I stand up in front of them. So thank you very much for your coming. Then do we have a lot of students here? Then some visitors from outside. So I'd like to invite also our two very honored guests from the IMF. Please. Let me call you Bapak and Ibu. This is quite common here. That's an honor of to have a guest here. Please, Mr. Enes and Pak Rector also. Okay. So I completely rely on my what you call it here, handphone, because I got to read the CV of these two speakers. Okay. In the very right of this table, we have Pragyan Dat. He's an economist in the IMF, and now also working as a desk economics division for the Myanmar. So we also can ask questions about Myanmar, the most the competitors of our investment. And Myanmar is also one of the competitors. And he got the PhD from London School of Economics. So students, if you want to work in the IMF, you have to get your PhD from LSE. So that's one of the key. The second one we have here, Miss, sorry if I wrongly pronounce you, and Anjana Banerjee. Angana Banerjee is a senior economist also in the IMF and responsible as a chief for Tonga. Then she got a PhD from Columbia University. So it's not relations. If you want to work in the IMF, you got to get PhD from both LSE and Columbia University. So go abroad. After the Atma Jaya, you have to go abroad, go, and go back work in the IMF. Okay. Thank you very much. We have about 20 or 25 minutes to hear the presentations of the IMF with a very provoking title, Caught in Prolonged Uncertainty. Again, just like Pak Rector said, uncertainty sometimes is an opportunity, but sometimes it's also a challenge. So I think you can manage which one first. Then, yeah. Do you have a sensor? What do you call it? That one? Okay.
Okay. So, good morning. Is it on?
Yeah.
Good morning. Pragyan and I are very happy to be here to speak with all of you. And we'd like to thank you very much for coming to hear us speak and for the organizers for organizing such a wonderful event with so much participation. We have a number of slides to get through, so if you don't mind holding off your questions until the end, we'd really appreciate it. Next slide. Our presentation will cover the global and regional outlook, forecasts for the region as well as certain countries, and it will discuss the risk to the outlook as well as policies to support medium-term growth and growth in the short term. And we will also take this opportunity to highlight some of the key conclusions from one of our 2 thematic studies this year on how Asian economies have managed capital flows. Turning now to the global environment, we move to the next slide. As you can see from the figures on the left, we are marking down the forecast for global growth to 3% in 2019. This is the slowest the world economy has grown since the global financial crisis. And this slowdown is synchronized across both emerging markets and advanced economies. The main concern is one of a prolonged period of policy uncertainty, stemming from trade tensions between China and the US, which we expect was going to last for a long time, despite some progress in talks more recently. And we expect this uncertainty to last for a long time, in part because it is complicated. The trade negotiations are complicated with concerns about technology and national security, human rights, and many other issues. All of this is likely to lead to delays and uncertainty over a long time. It could also lead to a realignment in complex global supply chains. And Asia is a very important part of the global supply chains. And this in turn could lead to a decline in confidence and investment in the region. So this is one of the most important factors weighing on the global outlook. And other geopolitical factors are also contributing to this. For example, there's uncertainty stemming from Brexit, geopolitical tensions between Japan and Korea, as well as unrest in Hong Kong. There's a long list of geopolitical events. Next slide. Asia has been particularly hit hard by these tensions. Manufacturing is suffering. Manufacturing is suffering in many countries, especially in the car and semiconductor industries. As you can see from the left figure, industrial production, which is a leading indicator of global growth in many countries, has been declining in many countries since late 2018. Indonesia is a bit of an aberration here, a different case because it's less open than other Asian economies. And when you look at the right figure and compare the shaded bars with the dots, you can see that compared to our forecasts, that's the bar, the investment outcomes have been much lower since the late 2018. The decline in manufacturing and real investment has led to a decline in global trade. If you look at the left figure, the black line is global trade, and it has been declining since late 2018. And this has hit Asia particularly hard because Asia relies a lot on trade, and it has hit China very hard. If you look at the right figure, you see that many countries in Asia, especially those which are export-oriented, like Korea and Hong Kong, have seen big declines in trade volumes since 2018. Turning now to our outlook. In line with the decline in global growth, it won't surprise you to hear that we have also marked down the forecast for how well Asia will grow. So Asia is now expected to grow at only 5% in 2019 and 5.1% in 2020. And like the global economy, this is the slowest pace of growth in Asia since the global financial crisis. Compared to what we were thinking in April of this year, this markdown in growth is across all Asian economies. And in some cases, like Korea and Hong Kong, which we show all the countries on our slide here, but for some cases like Hong Kong and Korea, the revisions are particularly large. For Indonesia, the revision in contrast is relatively small, minus 0.2 percentage points. And we will discuss the Indonesia forecast in a couple of slides. As you can see, compared to other regions, the GDP revision, the revision of outlook in Asia is less than other regions. There are other regions such as Latin America where the green bar, that is the downward revision in growth forecast for Latin America, is larger because of what has happened in a couple of countries like Argentina and Venezuela. But when you look at what has happened in investment and imports, Asia's slowdown is quite visible because Asia, the downward revisions are much larger than in Latin America. Turning to the good news though, even though Asia is slowing down or growing at a slower pace, Asia is still going to be contributing 70% of global growth in 2019. China will contribute around 39 or 40%, India 16%, the ASEAN region about 10%, and this contrasts with 11% for the US and 12% for the European region. So Asian growth is still propping up global growth, but the pickup in global growth in 2020 of 0.4 percentage points, the Asia's contribution is going to be less. Only about half of the pickup is due to Asian countries because in contrast with the ASEAN and India and other Asian countries, Japan and China are expected to grow much more slowly next year. Let me now discuss the forecast for a few specific countries. Take China. We are revising down our growth forecast. China is expected to grow by 6.1% in 2019 and 5.8% in 2020. And growth has been revised down continuously due to the trade tensions with the US, and also because of regulatory tightening within China, which was very needed, and that's going on, and that is also bringing growth down. Compared to our forecast in April, the downward revision of China is about 2.3%, due to 3/4 of this is due to trade tensions, and 1/4 is due to domestic fundamentals, which are weak in China. But the Chinese officials have taken policy measures to support growth. That is going to help growth be higher than the downward revision we had forecasted. And so the overall downward revision is actually going to be 0.8%, not the 2.3%, because of policy support provided by the Chinese officials. But it's important to note that because China is rebalancing its economy, focusing less on external demand, more on domestic demand, therefore, the policy support that the Chinese officials provide are less likely to lead to a larger demand for exports of its neighboring countries. Turning now to India, it suddenly slowed down. Growth came in much weaker than expected in the first quarter of this fiscal year, due to a number of reasons: weaknesses in the car and real estate sector, stresses in the non-banking financial sector, rural incomes being low, regulatory uncertainty, a number of factors. And it has been weak. The economy has been also weak in the second quarter of this fiscal year. But the policy support by the authorities, income support for the rural sector, monetary easing, cuts in interest rates, cut in corporate taxes, some regulatory clarity, is expected to support growth in the second half of this year. Now, Japan is an aberration. It is one of the only countries in Asia which is growing above potential, 0.9% expected in 2019, mainly because of private consumption and public investment. Its net exports are also declining in Japan because of the external environment being not that good. In 2020, we expect Japan to slow down to 0.5% because of the impact of the increase in consumption taxes in this month, in the previous month. And the external demand, external environment will continue to be weak, leading to a weak growth in net exports. And further complicating matters, accommodative monetary policy, interest rate cuts by the other big central banks of the world, And safe haven flows into Japan because of trade uncertainty or risk-off events is going to make it complicated for the Bank of Japan to reinflate the economy as it has been trying to do. Turning to Korea, despite some policy support, activity has remained sluggish as trade tensions have hit its tech-intensive exports very hard, and further headwinds are expected from continued trade tensions between the US and China and trade tensions with Japan. For the ASEAN as a whole, there's a similar story. External demand has been sluggish and declining, and therefore net exports are not expected to grow well. And this is for the same reasons, trade policy, US-China trade tensions. To some extent, this is counterbalanced by the fact that financial conditions or monetary policy in advanced economies have been lowered and financial conditions are supportive in the ASEAN region. But as you all know, this cannot be taken for granted because capital flows can be volatile to this region. Turning now to Indonesia. We are marking down our growth forecast from 5.2% to 5% in 2019. And this is mainly because of weak investment in 2019, delays in public infrastructure projects, as well as some delays in private sector investment because of political uncertainties related to the elections. In 2020, we expect growth to be stable because the election-related uncertainties are expected to abate and disappear. And the monetary easing that has taken place during the year, all these cuts in Bank of Indonesia interest rates, will help support the economy. Let me now turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague Pragyan so he can discuss the risks to the outlook.
Thank you, Angana. And let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming and giving us your valuable time. Hello? Yep. Okay. Okay. So, even with the downward revisions to the baseline that, even with the downward revisions to the baseline that Angana highlighted, the outlook for the region remains clouded by significant uncertainty and further downside risks. So, first is the risk of possible further escalation of the US-China trade tensions. The United States and China agreed to a first phase of a trade deal on October 11th, but the full details are not yet available. There's some news articles today that this might involve some of the tariffs being rolled back, etc., but we don't know. But what we do know is that in the interim, there remains a large uncertainty around trade policy. And as shown by the news charter measure that we construct using big data, basically looking at all the news articles related to trade and uncertainty and protectionism, we find that this continues to affect economic activity and primarily through confidence and financial market channels. So the measure we have constructed is country specific, and here on this slide we show this for China and the United States. And for our analysis, we consider two kind of scenarios. One is a trade escalation scenario, where this trade policy index we assume goes up to its highest level that we saw in 2018 and 19. This would basically be around the time when the trade talks collapsed and there were some tweets by the president. The other scenario is a trade truce scenario where we assume that the trade policy uncertainty index drops to lower levels seen basically, oops, where did it go? Sorry. Yeah, okay. Okay, let me not try that. It goes to the lower level. These are levels seen when a trade deal was imminent. Now, our analysis suggests that the investment to GDP ratio, which is shown on the left-hand chart here, and corporate spreads, the investment to GDP ratio could be about 1.5 to 2 percentage points lower over 2 years, and corporate spreads could be 35 to 50 basis points higher for China, EMs, and advanced Asia under the escalation scenario, which are the red bars. In contrast, a true scenario could provide a significant boost. And moving from investment to growth, we find that peak uncertainty under an escalation scenario would reduce growth by about 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points of GDP across the region. And symmetrically, if in case of a truce, GDP would be boosted. Now, one point I want to emphasize here is if you look at the graphs, we see that the negative impact for, say, emerging Asia and China are of the same magnitude. This is because these figures show you the impact on real GDP only from uncertainty. If one were to add the direct effects of tariffs, of course, the graphs would look very different, with China affected much more than the rest of Asia. Related to trade tensions, there is also the much discussed risk of dislocation of global value chains, and this is a rising concern. Data on this is still emerging and is a little hard because most of the global value chain indicators, the data is lagged by several years. So we only have data till 16 and 17. But what we can see on the left-hand chart is that countries with more sophisticated export products and presumably more complex supply chain linkages have been affected more significantly than others. And on the right-hand chart, we show some survey evidence which suggests that many US companies are reevaluating their business strategy in light of prolonged US-China trade tensions, and this may have impacted investment in China and in the associated supply chain. The second important risk is uncertainty about oil prices. Our current baseline forecasts and the projections that Angana showed you are underpinned by the assumption that global oil prices would decline to about $58 a barrel in 2020. But as we saw in September, where oil prices jumped to around $70 per barrel after the drone attacks in Saudi Arabia, this is a key risk to the region, particularly given that most of the countries are net oil importers, as seen in the right-hand chart. Increase in oil prices would be a drag on growth. On the other hand, if oil prices continue to remain low as they are now, it will be supportive of growth. The third uncertainty I want to talk about is related to financial conditions, which have shifted to being more accommodative as the major central banks have been easing policy. As Angana mentioned, this accommodative policies are supporting inflows of capital to the region, and this is seen on the right-hand side, and it's been relatively good and positive this year so far, other than in May and in August, where there were some outflows because of rising trade tensions. So this has been supporting growth in the region. But it also underscores the need and importance of having appropriate policies in place, both to manage these inflows, but also there's a chance that the financial conditions would tighten suddenly and capital flows could reverse, and then countries would need to be prepared to manage that. And this is particularly important because in the left-hand chart, if you see, the upper bar tells you what the US FOMC is saying about what is the future part of interest rates, while the lower black one is what we get from markets. And there's a significant gap between these two. And someone is obviously going to change their mind, and whatever, if the market needs to reevaluate the future part of interest rate, that could lead to sudden tightening of financial conditions. Now, this gives me a good segue to move into our thematic paper, which highlights which basically explains how Asian emerging markets have been managing large and volatile capital flows in their economies. So, large and volatile capital flows poses a central economic challenge for relatively open Asian emerging market economies. And these are typically expansionary for the domestic economy, as shown in this figure, where we see that during periods of strong capital inflows also leads to higher credit growth. So there's a strong movement between credit growth and capital flows. And they can also trigger disruptive swings in the exchange rate. Now, the textbook and theory will tell you that the floating exchange rates are insulation against foreign shocks, and they provide a buffer. But our analysis suggests that in the presence of financial frictions, for example, if you have unhedged balance sheet positions or if you have shallow financial markets, movements in exchange rate can amplify foreign shocks. So on the left-hand side, we have some micro-level analysis which we undertook for a large sample of Asian firms. And we find that while on average depreciation increases firm-level investment, it contracts investment in firms where the FX liabilities are large. Basically, if more than 20% of their debt is in FX, then we see that on the right side of this chart, we see that it is negative for investment. And if you're turning to the right-hand side chart, we see that in depreciation episodes, higher FX liabilities tends to weaken investment more in companies that are operating when they are in countries where there are less developed financial systems, where hedging opportunities are limited or costly. This is seen by the fact that this regression coefficient that we use is negative and significant for less developed markets, the red bar, while it's not the case for more advanced economies. The micro-level evidence is also supported by macroeconomic forecasts that we run. On the left-hand chart, we estimate the impact of one standard deviation shock to exchange rate on investment. And we see that in countries with less developed financial markets, the effects are significant and they are persistent all the way out to 12 quarters. A similar pattern is also observed in GDP on the right-hand chart, but then it is less persistent because what happens is as your exchange rate depreciates, initially you have the negative impact to investment, but over time you gain competitiveness and the negative impact is partly offset and it goes away after around 6 or 7 quarters. Now, what has Asian emerging markets done in response to capital flows? And what we find is that they have simultaneously deployed several policy tools to achieve multiple objectives. In particular, as you will see in the left-hand chart here, they have made extensive use of foreign exchange intervention to moderate exchange rate fluctuations in response to capital flows. And our estimates suggest that on average, Asian EMEs absorb in excess of about 2/3 of net inflows through foreign exchange interventions. In addition, they also adjust policy interest rate on the right-hand chart. But they respond not just to domestic inflationary pressures as your standard narrow view of monetary policy would suggest, but they actually respond to a host of other factors. So for example, we find that they respond to US interest rates, which suggests that they are taking into account the global financial cycle. Then they also respond to the changes in real effective exchange rate because this is particularly the case when the financial markets are less developed. And they also respond to broader credit conditions reflecting financial stability considerations. Our results on macro-prudential policy show that macro-prudential policy also appears to respond to the global financial cycle. with macro-prudential measures tightened in periods of strong capital inflows. And when inflation and credit growth displays an unwelcome uptick, then again, macro-prudential measures are used to support monetary tightening. Capital flow measures, though, have been used more sporadically, and they are not, at least we don't find them related to broader surges in capital flows. They are selectively used mostly in the case of housing-related risk. Now, to summarize, what we find is that faced with foreign financial shocks, Asian emerging markets deploy multiple instruments in pursuit of macro-financial stability objectives, and they do so in more complex ways than a traditional inflation targeting kind of policy framework would suggest, which is on the left-hand side. And the objective of our analysis is to understand better the costs and benefits of deploying these additional tools in a more complex way. And this may be a case where economic theory actually needs to catch up with economic practice that a lot of these central banks in the region are doing. And IMF is working on these issues in the context of their broader work plan, and we hope to have some more interesting results going forward. I now hand back to Angana for the policy discussion.
So, what should countries do in response to the current uncertain times? And before I delve into the policy discussion, let me apologize in advance because I set up the slides in a way that doesn't fully work with clickers, so I'll have to go back and forth a little bit just to make sure everything shows up in order. So obviously, the most important thing one can do to mitigate the economic effects of trade tensions is to diffuse trade tensions. And the IMF has been advocating for the international community to find a lasting solution to some of the legitimate concerns regarding subsidies, intellectual property, technology transfers, and to come up with a comprehensive international agreement that will make the international trading system much more stable and predictable. But that is not what something individual countries can often affect. It has to be a group effort. So what do individual countries do when they are faced with the current global environment? So, of course, every country has to devise policies based on their own specific conditions. Our general advice is if you have policy space, countries should use them to support the private sector in the short term, while keeping an eye on the medium term and making sure that there are sufficient buffers for the medium term and that there is enough effort to ensure that medium-term growth is sustainable and inclusive and also environmentally sustainable. Specifically, this means, and here I have to do my magic again, on fiscal policy, our advice is for countries that have policy space to use them to support the private sector. Many Asian countries, if you look at the left panel, like Indonesia, have very low debt compared to other regions. And they have fiscal space. And some countries have actually used some of this to provide fiscal stimulus and support the economy, and Indonesia is one of them. We forecast that in 2020, countries are going to, on average, keep either the fiscal stance neutral, meaning not provide additional stimulus, or provides a somewhat more of a support to the economy. For Indonesia, our recommendation has been to use this opportunity to do some fiscal rebalancing because the Indonesian government's objective of building buffers is the right one. And one of the things we have supported is to use this opportunity to move away from non-targeted subsidies for energy to make sure that the only subsidies provided is for those who need it, and slowly phase out subsidies for those who don't need it or who can afford to pay higher prices for energy. And we also have proposed that Indonesia come up with a medium-term revenue strategy to raise revenue to GDP ratios above 10%, because it needs the revenue to build infrastructure, which is going to help create jobs and improve the business environment. And it also needs the revenue to provide social safety nets to those who are more vulnerable in the economy. Regarding monetary policy, as you can see from the left, many Asian economies have low inflation, like Indonesia. And they have 10 out of 14 central banks in the region have used monetary policy to support the economy already, as has Indonesia. And we think this is highly appropriate. But it's also very important, the second part of this slide, to make sure that in the current situation where financial conditions globally are supportive, that countries make sure that they don't give rise to more vulnerabilities over the medium term. What does it mean? This means strengthen your regulations, proactively put macro-prudential regulations in place if you need to. Make sure that households and corporations don't take on more debt that they can handle, so that when the cycle turns, the countries have enough buffers to and enough strong frameworks to defend or handle the situation. And in Indonesia's case, much of this applies as well. But in addition, our recommendation is to improve its crisis management framework so that in the event it is faced with an economic downturn, it does not have to, it has the tools with which to manage financial sector vulnerabilities. The other big point that we are emphasizing is to keep an eye on the medium term and make sure that policies can help build sustainable and inclusive growth for the medium term, because unless growth and opportunities reach all sections of the population, it is very difficult to implement reforms and to grow the economy. And for Indonesia, this means creating opportunities for job opportunities for its young and growing population. And this then brings us back to its medium-term revenue strategy, that it needs to collect enough revenues to be able to put in place the policies that will improve its labor product market and financial markets, and provide increased female labor force participation and labor force participation for the young. With that, let me highlight summarize our presentation, which basically makes 3 key points, namely that Asia remains an engine of growth and will contribute 70% of 2019 global GDP growth, despite the fact that it's slowing down. In the short run, the region is at a critical juncture and it will face some slowdowns due to the trade tensions, and that its policy mix should focus on offsetting the negative impacts of prolonged uncertainty on the private sector, while ensuring that there are sufficient policy buffers in the long run. With that, we would like to open the floor for questions.
Oh, yep. Thank you very much. Then we can give them applause for the presentation. Thank you very much. Akan and Pragyan, I think one of the messages that we can learn here is that multiple policy or policy mix is quite difficult for us in the sense that we don't have that luxury. We have constraints in time, capacity, and also institutions, weak institutions sometimes also have become the big constraints of running this kind of policy. So in this situation, if you think about the priority of the sequence of the policy, which one then you can recommend first, and then the rest can follow. And the second one, maybe the question that we can also discuss, the negative relationship between the export performance, export growth, and export sophistications, and what that does it mean, and also the implication for the region then. we can start with discussion, then I'll let audience here to also raise the question, please.
So, so you won't like the answer I have to give you, which is that we should walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning strong institutions actually countries have to strengthen institutions at the same time as managing short-term macroeconomic changes, because they can provide positive synergies, and actually they can make a good situation better, and they can make a bad situation worse. To give you an example, I'm not going to use Indonesia as an example, but a country which has good institutions actually needs to provide less policy support, because investors are more confident about how the economy is going to work in a downturn, because they know the rule of how the rules apply, what the central bank will do, what the minister will do, so they know that the institutions will not work in a crazy manner. So when you do that, then you already give yourself a lot of power, because you don't need to support the economy as much with fiscal stimulus or monetary policy, because investors stay in. At the same time, you can imagine situations where if the institutions are weak and policymakers do things which are not conventional at very volatile times, it can make a bad situation worse. So if investors have liquidity challenges and they want to leave a certain country, if they have a choice of which country they want to leave first, they will leave the country where they are uncertain about how the institutions work and how predictable the policymakers are going to be in their policy response. So because of these interconnections, we would urge countries to do both, strengthen macro management and institution building. They take time, and it will not happen overnight, but the benefits of doing both at the same time are tremendous.
Just to add that the standard framework of policy of one target, one instrument has the benefit that it is simple and it is well understood. So in some ways, a country which is still building institutions or the institutions are not well established, it has its attractiveness. And therefore, we emphasize on the costs and benefits of moving away from this and going to a multiple instrument approach. To give you another example of something like what Angana mentioned, generally, we also say that inflation targeting central banks should refrain from doing a currency intervention or FX intervention, because otherwise you muddy the waters of what the central bank is doing. So you say the central bank is exclusively an inflation targeter, it will adjust interest rates and not do anything else. Now the question is, okay, if you're doing FX intervention, what does it do to the credibility of your inflation target per se? And we have done some analysis, it's still work in progress, but basically what we see that if you have very good institutions and if you have confidence in the inflation target already, in that case, some FX intervention does not necessarily weaken or disanchor inflation. On the other hand, if your inflation target is already under doubt or your inflation expectations are not anchored, and then if you complicate the system by having other objectives or other tools, that would have greater impact. So in some ways, what Angana was saying, you need to do both. Can you remind us of your second question?
Export sophistication.
Oh, on export sophistication. So the challenge here on everyone is asking what is happening with global value chains and supply chains. And as I was trying to explain, we don't have the data. So the data you have on actually global value added, the value chain effect, it actually ends in 2016 or latest 2017. So how do you kind of assess the impact? The chart that I showed you, what it essentially does is it looks at countries which have less sophisticated exports versus more sophisticated exports. For example, countries that are more involved in technology, high-tech exports, for example, Korea, versus other countries which are exporting more basic products like textiles, etc. And we see what has been the impact on their exports over the recent period. And just a basic correlation is we find that countries with more sophisticated exports have seen a larger decline in exports, which seems to suggest that those that are better integrated in global value chains may be more affected. Now, as I said, this is some very basic analysis because you have two other factors going on at the same time. You have the technology-related tensions per se and the changes in the tech cycle where things were moderating. And you also have the autos in various countries which are also depressed. So it is possible that this relationship is picking up more sector-specific weakness in autos and in semiconductors than per se global value chains. But this is like some indicative evidence that we are trying to show of possible disruptions in global value chains. And yes, we are trying to figure out more, get more data and try to do a better and more rigorous job of analyzing global value chains.
Thank you, Dr. and Angana. So I'll open the session then. If you have some question then, I'll remind you that the MC has some souvenirs to distribute. If you have a very good question, if you ask more questions, then more souvenirs are given to you. So please raise your hand. Don't see Rector. Don't get afraid. Okay, number one there. Any other questions? Okay. First of all, let's stimulate the discussion with the souvenirs. You can give the souvenirs to... there are many more, I guess. Okay, can you please also give the microphone? Please stand up, introduce yourself. Okay, so prepare with your question and you got the souvenir. That's why we have to use Chinese product.
Yeah, let me introduce myself first. My name is Febrian Kennedy, and I'm a student at Atma Jaya University. What I want to ask is, as we know, Hong Kong is one of the largest financial hub in Asia. Do you think there is a connection between the lowering investment in Indonesia and the political unrest in Hong Kong? Thank you.
Well, so neither of us, as you heard from our introduction, work on either Indonesia or Hong Kong. But I would suspect that the Hong Kong political unrest adds to the general global uncertainty. But it is not so related with what's happening in Indonesia. In part because of the timing, but the weaknesses that you see happened well before Hong Kong's unrest started, one. And second, because in Indonesia, our team that works very closely on Indonesia, they think it is related to domestic political uncertainties in Indonesia. That has led to delays in investment, and also there have been some delays in public investment that have, in order to reduce the current account deficit in Indonesia. Otherwise, Indonesia's fundamentals are pretty good, and its consumption is still pretty strong. So we don't see that much of a link between the unrest in Hong Kong right now and Indonesia's performance since 2018 so far.
Don't worry too much about Hong Kong. We still have demonstration out of the campus when the economy still runs well. So if you have any other question, again, the souvenir is still there. There are so many souvenirs there. Don't get silence. So, okay, let me stimulate again the question. If we see one of the slides, then that there was a statement that the performance in Asia more or less influenced by the performance in other regions. So the question is about, is there any spatial diffusion on that, and spatial in terms of the space, how they connect it, and then what kind of transmission mechanism that impact one region to another regions. As you know, even though India isn't that, it's not there in the new RCIP, then we somehow believe that if we can cooperate together in the region, then the external impact can be absorbed somehow. But then at the same time also we see these multiple attacks, from those economic variables also simultaneously affect the countries. So if the spatial aspect are important, and how do you see this situation to respond then?
So we encourage countries in the region to also keep their focus on trade liberalization, even though it exposes them to external factors more, but still to stay committed to trade liberalization in a way, in part because of this other question that you answered. If you have, typically when people do trade liberalization, its parliament has approved the regulations and the trade pact. That means that the country has made a strong commitment to certain reforms that it will take place over time. And this is basically helps with providing confidence to investors and those who engage in trade, that those commitments are sacrosanct. It's not so easy to reverse some of these trade contracts. And even if you forget about the RCEP for a bit, but there are other regional agreements which ASEAN member countries have signed on to. And many countries are implementing these changes. I know Indonesia, Vietnam, they are slowly committing to reducing tariffs, opening up their markets, introducing competition, strengthening technology transfers. And there are estimates which said that these itself can provide a boost to productivity and growth in these countries. The only issue is sometimes these growth occurs over a few years, over the medium term. And so there is adjustment process in the short term as the economy gets used to the competition coming from trading partners who now have access to your market. So this is why it's important to use policy buffers to help manage and mitigate the effect of these adjustments on the local population. Make sure there are enough training programs for workers who need to move across sectors, and to manage somehow the short-term impact of trade liberalization. But over the medium term, this can have a very beneficial effect if by strengthening institutions and collectively committing to preserve those institutions and therefore preserve investor confidence. So that's how I would see it. You want to add?
Just to add to what I'm going to say is basically, just to add to what I'm going to say is, basically, yes, Asia is more affected now than some of the other regions because it is more exposed to trade and is more, so that's why the growth revisions in Asia have been larger. But we should not forget over the longer term, Asia has also benefited enormously because it is more exposed to trade, and has been a large source of growth for Asia and in particular for the ASEAN region. So, and there's a large body of evidence that no one gains from a trade war, and free trade generally is beneficial both in terms of Pareto efficiency and producing things more efficiently and cheaply, but also for associated technology transfers, adopting best practices, etc. and etc. So yes, it exposes countries more to external demand, but it's also a source for growth. And in general, I think we are supportive of further trade liberalization and addressing and solving these tensions.
Still, I open the session then. For those taking economics of development, you get 5 points if you have last question for me. Apart from the souvenir, you get also some points from me. Okay, raise your hand. Should I increase to 10 points?
Yeah, we like when people challenge us. There are no stupid questions. Every question is very hard for us. So, please.
No stupid question. Any question? Yeah. Anyone? Maybe Paji, you want to stimulate the discussion with your questions? Okay.
Thank you very much. I think information has large impact on financial market. We talk about financial stability. How about the hawks, Facebook, social media can impact the financial stability on, especially Indonesia? Yeah. How about your opinion? Thank you.
It's a new political variables, yeah, on social media, then how they influence the market and also at the same time the financial sector.
So we've actually looked at it at the IMF, and there have been a couple of countries where this has happened, not necessarily Facebook, but through the spread of rumors that if you believe a bank is weak, and if you believe a country is weak, then it triggers a confidence effect. So if you believe your bank is going to go down, you are just lining up to pull your deposits out, and even if the bank was fine, before the bank can even convince anyone, there is a bank run and it causes financial stability problems. So this has happened, I know personally, of at least 2 countries, and I'm sure there are many more. The solution there is basically stronger institutions and confidence in the economy, that if you are confident that the Central Bank of Indonesia is doing its job, then you don't listen to what your aunt is saying on Facebook. So it's the relative strength of institutions that matter tremendously. It also makes a difference if you have a good crisis management framework. So suppose there is a confidence effect and there's a bank run, even if the bank was solvent. If you have a good crisis management framework, any bank, any central bank can handle a situation like that. There are well-known practices in the US. You basically address the concerns, you take over the management, you provide liquidity so that anyone who wants to take deposits out of the bank can take it. You make public announcements, and you communicate with the public, and you rebuild confidence in the bank. And by Monday, everything is taken care of. The U.S. does this all the time. The FDIC is extremely good about that. So the bottom line is that there are many possible ways in which one can trigger a run on a bank or financial stability concerns. The solution is always to have good frameworks and strong institutions ready to deal with any eventuality and convince the public that things are in good hands. And so Facebook is just one manifestation of a potential problem. Before Facebook, this happened through other means. So it's not new in a way, it just happens faster these days.
And bigger. Okay, if you still have any question? We still have a lot of time until tomorrow. Okay. Which hand? Oh, that one, yeah, please, okay. Souvenir, please. Okay.
Okay, my name is Irene Saragosa. Direct to the question. Speak about the tight policy investment. You will say that the difference between the good investment country and not good investment country. When we know that US and China has been economic war right now, and I want to ask you about this. Is there a relation why in Asia, especially in Indonesia, the flow of investment is decreased? And the second is, I want to ask about what do you think about the investment policy in Indonesia compared with the good investment country? And what should Indonesia do to resolve this problem? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. 3 questions. I think it's quite good. More souvenir.
So let me rephrase the question, just to make sure I understood it properly. The question was what do I think of Indonesia's infrastructure investment?
Yeah, that's the last question.
And the first one was about interest rate policies.
No, the war between the US and China.
Okay, and its impact.
Right.
It's on.
Impact on the good investment country and the bad one.
Okay, then sorry, that's
the difference impact from this trade war through the different types of platforms.
okay. So the impact on Indonesia has been a little less than some of the other countries, in part because Indonesia is a little less open to the external markets than, say, China is. Similarly, when you saw the slowdown in India, it is all because of local factors, not external factors as much, because India is also less open. But other countries like Korea, Hong Kong, China are extremely open, so they got affected much more. So this is the degree to which you're externally open has mattered. But at the same time, Indonesia's fundamentals have been good, and its domestic demand and consumption have been good, which is why Indonesia's growth forecasts are not that marked down, because over the years, Indonesia has built enough buffers on monetary policy that it can provide support when it is needed. This is exactly what countries should be doing. And this has helped make sure that whatever impact there is of the external environment, it has been mitigated because there is enough scope to provide some policy support. Regarding infrastructure, the view of our India specialists at the IMF is Indonesia, there's scope to do a lot more because there's a lot of inequality across regions, and so there's a lot of scope to build more infrastructure. But Indonesia has low debt, and the government does not necessarily want to wants to keep its debt at a manageable level. So the only way it can actually spend on infrastructure is by raising more revenue. And its main problem is its revenue collection at 10% of GDP is too low compared to other countries in the region. So this is where the emphasis has to be, that it needs to find better ways to collect revenue so that it can fund infrastructure across the country and help the rest of the regions also grow and create jobs more effectively. Hope that answered your question.
If I add, the impact of US-China trade tensions and associated uncertainty and how it's distributed among different countries also depends on how they are directly linked to the value chain, to what extent they are linked, and also in the domestic conditions that these countries have. For example, some countries, there's some indication that, for example, Vietnam is actually benefiting from US-China trade tensions because you are being diverted and that's getting a destination where things could improve. On the other hand, then it also depends on what kind of other infrastructure you have. Can you provide a suitable alternative for investment that would have gone into China but is being redirected? You could benefit if you have the infrastructure, if you have the labor costs, if you have the policies in place of doing business, etc., to benefit. On the other hand, it also depends on what exports are. If you're already supplying to the value chain to China, then you would be negatively affected. So the chart that we showed you here on the impact of trade policy uncertainty was basically based, we showed the aggregate for emerging market Asia. We could also do this for individual countries. It's obviously more difficult to do for individual countries because you have to control for specific factors. For example, Philippines, the investment in 1 year may have been gone down because of domestic reasons, but there were also external factors. So how do you separate the two? So estimating it becomes more difficult. But in general, what is the condition in the domestic economy, how it is linked, is also partly to explain where the impact would go.
Yeah, that one of the factor that made our president upset when he knew that those investors went to Vietnam and Myanmar, not to this country, even one of them. So he was disappointed with this and tried to run a new policy that enforce all the bureaucrats to a bit more friendly with the investor, all the things, and also the one that you just mentioned about the change in institutions. So it's quite interesting knowing this situation. We didn't get any benefit from the war, but our neighbors got it. Okay. Still, you start talking with the openness, and again, from the textbook, from the literature, we also know that openness has already two sides of the coin. And, apart from the positive one, the negative one is we are prone to the change, any change in this external market. So, how then do you think we should manage our economy in terms of the openness?
So, as we've said in our different answers, we think openness has served Asia well. Asia has grown very fast. And Asia has shown the world how to sort of manage being exposed to the global environment in terms of tools and using various macro-prudential policies to mitigate the effects of capital flows. And it has come up with, and this is what was covered in our regional thematic study, it is a number of tools with which it manages the impact of a volatile capital inflows. And if you look back, if you look at how, although Asia is growing more, we expect Asia to grow more slowly this year, 5% is still a pretty good number. And Asian countries are still resilient. And it has a lot of buffers to support the short-term external fluctuations. And this is basically, the way to manage. If you're exposing yourself to the external world, making sure you have enough policy tools and strong frameworks to manage the effect of shocks is the best way to open up your markets. And Asia has sort of shown the way by being still one of the strongest growing region at a very difficult time in the global economy.
Yeah, I think basically Asia has been the fastest growing region for a long time, and it's been contributing to world GDP growth for several years now. And again, we can break that down into how much is domestic demand, how much is foreign demand, but external demand has played a very important role. So yes, at the same time, it has been the source of growth, but it also creates exposures to potential foreign shocks which you can impact. And the policy response there would be, as Angana mentioned, to have enough buffers and enough frameworks, which Asia has done, to be honest, by and large, to manage the negative shocks and to tide them and to, in some ways, counter-cyclically protect the domestic economy from external shocks, and that would be the policy advice.
Can we expect new players in the region, apart from the traditional one, like India, China? Is there any new emerging economy apart from this?
So, we are, as and when countries upgrade their institutions, they become, when foreign investors look for new markets in which to operate, they become the prime place. And the world is evolving in funny ways because fintech is now the rage, and as you can see that countries which we didn't always think of would be at the technological frontier are now becoming at the technological frontier. So it's very hard to predict who the new winners will be. It's also hard to know what the real reasons are for countries who are becoming players. So for example, I used to work on Vietnam up until earlier this year. And although there is a lot of trade FDI into the economy, it's not clear whether it's because trade wars or because they're improving their institutions or because they're committing to free trade or because, there are many different factors that are driving these global supply chains. Sometimes it's geography, sometimes it's tax, sometimes it's cheap labor, sometimes it's good quality labor. Sometimes it is cultural. And so we not in the business of picking the next new player.
Okay, is there any questions? Okay, please, yeah. Just thank you.
So thank you for the change. My name is Jenny, and I'm taking development economics at Atma Jaya University. You mentioned before about sustainable economy, and as we know that we have 17 goals in sustainable development goals, and the 8th one is economic growth. So I would like to know what EMF already do to face sustainable economy, and what will EMF do to face the sustainable economy to help boost the economic growth towards 2030? Thank you.
She's the chair of Committee of Financial Days for the coming week, and one of the issues of sustainable finance. That's why the question is about that.
So the IMF has been focusing a lot on the sustainable development goals. It's the UN focuses on that, but the IMF has very recently started costing the impact, how much it would cost countries to achieve their sustainable development goals within a certain period. And I know it has done the exercise for both Indonesia and Vietnam. I know the number for Vietnam, it's 6.5% of GDP, but I don't remember the estimate it did for Indonesia. So when our IMF teams come and have the policy discussions with the authorities in Indonesia, they look into, when they're thinking of how much revenue the government needs to raise, they very much focus on not just all the regular investments the government has to do, but also how much investment it needs to do in order to meet its sustainable development goals. And the IMF in particular focuses on costing investment, sustainable goals in infrastructure, water, education, health, and yeah, that's it. And so it is very much part of our conversation with the policymakers in Indonesia.
So thank you again. You raised the issue on a very important thing right now, sustainable development goals. Okay, well, I think already come up with the last session. We will thank you for the two speakers with the very nice presentation. That we learned a lot about what's going on in the region and what kind of inspiration that we can get from the next coming futures. Again, thank you very much for Prakhyan and they are leaving soon because they got to catch up the plane back to DC. But then before that, I think the campus has something to hand on to you then. Please, Pak Aji or the MC first. Then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the guest speakers. We really learned a lot from today, especially on how the Asian policymakers approach the management of international capital flow and how the further strengthen in economic growth in Asia. And I would like to invite Ms. Dwinita to give the token of appreciation. Please come forward. Please give a round of applause.
For both or for okay. Yes, it's a puppet. Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as the saying goes, everything that begins has to an end. So thank you, Ms. Anggana and Mr. Pragyan, for your time for today. So we have reached to the end of the seminar. On the behalf of committee, I would like to apologize if there are any mistakes during the seminar. May I thank you very much for all your active participation in the seminar section. I hope you enjoyed the seminar and learned something new from today's activity. That's it, and thank you for today. Okay, so for those who haven't signed for your absence letter, you can have your sign on the back of this room.